And now we're joined by Adam Johnson, host of Citations Needed. Adam, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Yes, thanks for having me having me on.
Returning champion.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, do I get a yellow or green jacket or something?
That is one of our interns should be sending that in the mail right now. Okay, so
good.
You did go to Men's Warehouse for the fitting, right?
The Three Timers Club.
Very exclusive.
Speaking of Yellow Jacket, I was watching, I just kind of flipping through the channels last night, and Happy Gilmore was on, and I haven't watched that movie in a while, and I don't know where you both would rank it. I know this is not what we were planning on talking about, but Adam just made me think about it. Where would you rank that in the Adam Sandler movie history? And do you like that movie? Because that's my top one.
I was never a big Adam Sandler guy. I felt like I was a little bit in the minority. I just thought the shtick got a little old. I mean, I want to say when I was like 10 when it came out, I thought it was funny, but then I became pretentious and it was just not my thing.
Yeah.
When I discovered you could signal your superior to people through cultural proxy, and swore off all things Adam Sandler. No, I don't know. I would say of the early Adam Sandler, I believe it's one of the best. I would think, right, relatively speaking.
Yeah, it's got to be top 2 or 3.
It certainly has a lot of memorable lines.
I was really at the exact age to really love Happy Gilmore when it came out. I was like 12 or something when it came out, and it's it stood alone there. I was also a big fan of Sandler. He had the comedy tapes that he did.
Yeah, we used to listen to those.
Me and my friends listened to those. Yeah.
Yeah, when we were
kids. I was a big Sandler head.
We listened to it on CD.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Yeah.
New fancy new technology to listen to the Kevin Nealon farting hypnotist gag.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. What else was there? There was Toll Booth Willie. Right.
Yep.
And there was,
The Talking Goat, of course. That was the classic.
Goat. Yeah, that's right. I forgot he did those comedy albums. Wow, I'm having major flashbacks.
Yeah. This is nostalgia zone here.
Anyway.
I love that. I really do like when Sandler does the dramatic stuff, though. Like, I don't know if you would separate his wacky comedies and the dramatic stuff. Like, I really like his performance in Punch Drunk Love. He was obviously really fantastic in the gambling movie, Uncut Gems.
He's a good dramatic actor. I mean, I feel like most comedians are good dramatic actors because it's very similar, like things you're tapping into, right? Kind of empathy and like, I feel like it's much easier to go that way than the other direction. As indicated by J.D. Vance, who appears to be completely incapable of telling a most basic joke, which is painful because it's kind
just
of an
charisma magnet, J.D. Vance.
Well, I have a theory that the biggest predictor of winning an election is being funny. Trump very funny, Obama very funny, Biden funny, Reagan funny, Clinton funny, George W. Bush, sorry to say, also funny. Last unfunny president we had was George H.W. Bush, who was not funny, but he was really riding Reagan's coattails, and Reagan was unfortunately very funny. So the question then becomes: Is Harris funnier than Trump? And I think she's funny. I think she's actually funny.
I would say
they need to let her be funny. Rather than try to do what they did to Hillary, where they're like, you need to look like a sort of, stern vice president meets a housewife. You're not allowed to make jokes ever.
Well, they seem to be leaning into the coconut tree stuff and the unburdened by what has been.
I don't think the campaign
that kind of stuff.
Other people are.
The campaign is doing it on some of their social. I assume there's a bunch of like internet.
Well, they're not shying away from it.
Running some of those stuff. They also have a lot of like proxy social media stuff where it's sort of funded by big Democratic donors, and it's like not technically with the campaign, but it's like campaign adjacent. And of course, they bribe a bunch of TikTok influencers to. The Washington Post reported on a couple months ago. So I think it's kind of a blurry area in terms of who's the campaign and who's kind of just a social influencer hanger on.
Yeah. There's a lot. I mean, that's just kind of digital strategy in general. Now everyone is paying that because very rarely do you have somebody in-house on staff at an organization like this who is also successful making that kind of content. So it's just easier to pay them for video or on contract. But yeah,
that way if they go off program and they do something wrong, you could say, I don't know this guy. It's like every third Trump tweet has some weird Nazi symbolism in it. And he goes, I don't who, what?
Yeah.
As an intern. Like, where are you recruiting from, buddy? You noticing a pattern?
Well, and that's the thing. It's like if the Democratic Party wasn't currently co-sponsoring a genocide, we could talk about this kind of campaign stuff and the minutia and who's funnier and build a case for Harris's campaign. But unfortunately for everybody, that is happening, and Harris is now, if she does not play this correctly, is going to be left holding the bag and is going to be just as culpable as Biden has been for it. So that's the kind of delicate line that she's going to be trying to watch, that she's going to be trying to walk right now. And so far, it does not look great that she's going to be able to successfully manage that.
Yeah, no, I mean, so let's talk about that. I have a piece coming out theoretically today or tomorrow. I don't know what the holdup is on edits, but basically this issue of like, where does Harris stand on the quote unquote ceasefire issue or the genocide in Gaza? And I think a lot of people, and I've been writing about this nonstop for months, because there is a key issue here that a lot of people are confused about, and I think understandably so, because I think it's deliberately confusing, which is this idea that Biden supports a ceasefire. So for the first few months of the assault on Gaza, which quickly became a genocide, Biden, the Secretary of State Blinken, issued a memo basically banning people in the White House from using the C word. They weren't allowed to use the word ceasefire, de-escalation, anything like that. That they were all in on this. They're going to go all in. Then 10,000 died, 20,000 died, 15,000 children, 17,000 children. Obviously, horror after horror on people's social media timelines. Come February 2024, they realize they have a major PR problem on their hands as the uncommitted effort, which is and concentrated in states like Michigan, but also Minnesota, New York, elsewhere, to vote in uncommitted as a form of protest against Biden's support of genocide in Gaza, that this was becoming a little bit embarrassing. So they did the most cynical thing you can do, and something, frankly, if I made $700,000 a year and worked for the Biden administration and had a soul lobotomy, this is what I would advise them to do, which is to embrace the term ceasefire, but just change the meaning of the term, which is ultimately what they did, which is to say ceasefire in the context of Gaza through previous conflicts, 08, 09, 14, 18, 21, had a very specific meaning. This is why everybody from Amnesty International to Oxfam to 18 UN agencies to 400 ex-Biden staffers called for a ceasefire, because it had a specific meaning in the context of Israel-Gaza, which is Israel withdraws and stops bombing. And then, now it doesn't mean that there's peace or whatever, there's a kind of a long-term armistice, but they stop the particular military campaign, which is almost always 99% one way, because they have bombs and F-16s and F-22s and F-35s, and people in Gaza don't. So what it meant historically is the U.S. says, Israel, it's time to wrap it up. You're done. They make the phone call. That's it. Realizing this, Biden then pivots the definition of ceasefire to some negotiated settlement between the two, when Israel's position is that Hamas must surrender to have a ceasefire. Now, demanding surrender is not historically or intellectually, honestly, what a ceasefire is. A ceasefire is when you cease fire. It is not when you win a war. So what they did is ever since February and March, they said they support a ceasefire. What they really mean is two things. Number one, what used to be called a temporary pause, which is what happened in last November when they stopped fighting for about, quote unquote, fighting, which is to say Israel stopped slaughtering Palestinians en masse for a week so they could have hostage exchanges. Okay. But Israel is very clear that in the event of any temporary pause, they reserve the right to continue their war until Hamas is, quote unquote, eliminated. The official position vis-a-vis Matt Miller, who's the secretary, or rather the State Department spokesperson, Anthony Blinken, is that the U.S.'s position is that Hamas cannot exist post-war. Now, there's a word for that. It's called fighting the war until you win the war, until you eliminate both militarily and the government apparatus of Hamas, or anyone they define as Hamas, which is to say really any Palestinian militant, including PIJ, PFLP, you name it. Okay? So that's not what a ceasefire is. That's certainly not what Oxfam, Amnesty International, the Palestinian diaspora, Palestinian civil society within Palestine, 18 UN agencies, hundreds of Nobel laureates, when they originally in October, November, December were calling for a ceasefire, the idea of punting to some nebulous so-called ceasefire negotiations was not what they meant. What they meant is that Biden makes the phone call and says, we're cutting you off if you don't stop. because the U.S. has dispositive power to do that. And everybody knows that. Bruce Weidel at the Brookings Institute repeats this over and over again. Everybody knows this. Everyone in the Beltway, everyone in Israel, and Israel, to their credit, they're very honest about this. They're usually very open in their genocidal rhetoric, but as well as they're understanding they're dependent almost unilaterally on U.S. support, not just in terms of munitions and weapons and air support and diplomatic support of the UN. But Israel can't fight a war on three fronts. They can't fight a war against Yemen, Hezbollah, and militants in Gaza. They can't do that. They're a relatively small country, a fairly poor country. So everybody knows that Biden has dispositive power over this war. He can end it whenever he wants. So that was the definition. But ever since the White House co-opted the term, and then they let Vice President Harris go on, give a speech saying she supports a ceasefire. This confused a lot of people. And it confused people by design. And I wrote a piece for my Substack like a month ago, basically saying that the White House's fake ceasefire gambit worked really, really well, because it actually genuinely did confuse a lot of people. I think it's one of the things, along with colleges going on summer break and the police crackdown, I think is one of the things that really kind of dulled, and of course the kind of run up to the general election when everybody begins to fall in line. I think it's one of the things that really took the wind out of the protest movements in key ways, because it genuinely did confuse people. Now you could say perhaps we should not have coalesced around the demand of a ceasefire, because it was ambiguous, because in different contexts it does mean different things. Even though in Gaza everybody knew what it meant, it has an historical precedent again from previous conflicts. But the demand now, and this was as I write in my piece, which theoretically should be coming out in these times, either Thursday or Friday, is that when the seven labor unions, SEIU, UAW, among others, came out in support of cutting off military aid to Israel a few days ago, in the eve of Netanyahu's speech to Congress, representing 6 million workers, that this was representative of the shift in demands from Palestinian activists and from things like the uncommitted movement, which was to no longer use the word ceasefire, because again, it had been so warped and co-opted by the White House, it had been rendered meaningless, because now it just meant something else entirely. It meant sort of, Israel goes on a genocide smoke break and then they go back to, killing people. That the demand now was to cut off military to Israel, because and it's sort of like how Black Lives Matter got so co-opted in 2014. How by the time 2020 came, a George Floyd protest, activists moved to things like abolish or defund the police because they were less co-optable, because they weren't as nebulous. And I think there's a similar, it's obviously not one-to-one, but there's a similar dynamic where you say, okay, Biden keeps giving a bunch of speeches and ostensibly supports a quote unquote end of the war, but yet he still sends munitions, weapons, and military hardware to slaughter Palestinians. And I still see Palestinians dying on my timeline every day, keep getting slaughtered, because part of the so-called negotiation is Israel killing civilians as a form of exerting pressure. This is, by the way, by their own admission, to exert pressure on Palestinians to submit, to basically surrender. And Netanyahu, from all intents and purposes, is very sincere in this. And this is not a fringe position. People like to paint this as some kind of far-right position within Israel. It's not. It's a generally popular position. Now, it's true that Netanyahu is hated by and large in Israel, but he's hated for kind of unrelated reasons. And that for the most part, Israeli society and the Israeli public and most Israeli electeds do support, quote unquote, eliminating Hamas. Now, there's some wiggle room about what a temporary pause could sort of bring, that it's mostly posturing, that people want Hamas to go in the abstract, but if they had a choice between them staying in power and having some kind of political or negotiated settlement and get all the hostages back, they would take it. There's a lot of gray area in how you sort of frame the question in polling. But ultimately, Israel has been very clear about their intentions. They've carried them out to the T. They are engaging, again, openly in collective punishment, to great extent ethnic cleansing. Their goal, according to the Washington Post, reported in December of last year, was to push as many Palestinians into Egypt or to have them emigrate to Europe or North America as possible. They're pretty explicit about that. They haven't changed course. These negotiation settlements, Egyptian negotiators said they were have several times accused Israel of doing it purely for media consumption, for Western media consumption. So sort of Israel looks busy doing diplomacy theater. Meanwhile, of course, as long as the bombs, weapons, and military support show up on time, we can use the ceasefire word all we want. And the word ceasefire and 250 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks, right?
This will surely, as we saw play out yesterday in DC, at the same time Netanyahu was speaking, we will likely see demonstrations in Chicago for the DNC. And I saw you talking about this earlier today online. The city is already implementing measures to crack down on protesters. What are you seeing, and what do you expect to see outside the venue, outside of the safe area, whatever they call like the secure area at these conventions?
So my partner Sarah Lazar and we are covering the DNC for the Nation. So we'll be inside and outside, and she's doing pre-reporting. I'm going to try to sort of summarize some of the reporting she's doing. She has a piece coming out in the Nation pretty soon for this, talking with the organizers of the protests, on the DNC protests. It's led almost, Chicago, Cook County has the biggest Palestinian American population in the United States. These are people who have, literally every one of them has had someone die. Typically dozens of family members die. And I think the numbers that we're getting, 40,000, are not even remotely close. And
it's
I think
been paused at around that number for what feels like 6 months now.
Yeah, and the bombing has reduced slightly, but not by that much. And of course, people are dying from disease, starvation, and
people under the rubble
illness,
as well.
diabetes, asthma, people under the rubble, right? So I'm sure the numbers many magnitudes higher than that. They're protesting because, it's all they can do. Everything else has either been criminalized or is fruitless. The Democratic Party is ostensibly supposed to be accountable to these communities. Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, openly courted the Palestinian community in Chicago to win the election. He is now building a perimeter. So, as I know, protesters can protest from Schaumburg or Niles or Northbrook in the suburbs. It's a pretty wide perimeter. The goal, of course, is it's all rah-rah stuff. The DNC is all rah-rah stuff. So our goal as reporters who have access inside is to really bring the protesters' demands inside to the extent possible. Hopefully we don't get kicked out, but who knows? And there's other reporters as well that are making that their goal, because they're going to be so far away and so erased from the narrative, which has pivoted to a kind of rah-rah, Kamala Harris narrative, because people want to sort of project a actual ceasefire position on Harris that I've seen no evidence for. Now, it's very possible that could change. There's still a lot of time. I know groups are working to do that. I know Representative Rashida Tlaib has said she's withholding her endorsement until there's some indication as to what her position is. But based on her history, based on her talks at AIPAC, based on her fundraising from pro-Israel donors, based on previous rhetoric. Now, I don't think anyone would expect the vice president to necessarily publicly separate themselves from the president. I know the Wall Street Journal did a little wish casting claiming that she had a different position or that she would take a different track. And I think it's possible. I know that a lot of Biden's hardcore Zionist commitment was really based, it's one of the things that funded his early career, but it also was based on a kind of generational, idealized version of what kind of Israel is. You see Bernie Sanders trafficking in this kind of language as well. He lived on a kibbutz when he was in the 1960s. This kind of romantic vision of Israel that is just not at all consistent with the reality of what it is, and certainly what it is today. And that Harris maybe is somewhat of a generational break from that. But, Harris has never been someone with firm political commitments either way. She's always been a little bit of a chameleon based on whatever the context is. She shifts positions very easily. Of course, in 2019, she tried to take more progressive positions. Nobody really believed it. Then she kind of changed them and then changed back. So to the extent to which she would change, which is actually can be good for you, right? Because in theory, if they see real political pain, if they see a continued disconnect and dissent and anger among young voters because of Gaza, and that albatross gets hung on her campaign, theoretically, she could, for the purposes of self-preservation, could make some commitments. Who knows? Obviously, she's not the president, although the way people talk about her now, they sort of just act like she's the president, which is kind of amusing, but that's a separate conversation. The one kicker card, I think the one thing that does give me a little hope is that Biden's hardcore support of Israel has been somewhat unpopular within the quote unquote deep state, specifically the CIA, which traditionally is more critical of Israel. And we know this because CIA mouthpiece David Ignatius of the Washington Post has been doing a soft, like Israel, it's time to wrap it up routine for a few months now. There's been leaks from the CIA critical of Biden. So my assumption is that if, Obama basically handed over the previous Democratic president, Barack Obama, basically handed over foreign policy in many ways to the CIA. And if Biden can and again, when William Burns, the head of the CIA, goes and does negotiations, they're real negotiations. They're not theater like what Blinken does, where he goes there and does does some humanitarian photo ops and goes home because he knows nothing's going to change. The CIA has kind of developed a parallel, like, here's what an actual ceasefire would look like situation, with a understanding that it would require the president to do it unilaterally. So there is some hope that maybe elements within the so-called deep state, elements within the CIA, even the Pentagon, could be like, all right, it's time to wrap it up. This has obviously done tremendous damage to these kind of lofty ambitions of the State Department and the CIA in places like Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Africa. They've completely eroded any credibility they've had. And to
They're
the
delegitimizing the very concept of international law by
they don't give a shit about international law, but I think
Yeah.
what they do give a shit about is the sort of patina of international law. I think they care about the PR of international law, and I think that the genocide has. I mean, again, the credibility was already fairly limited, I think, but at least there was a little bit of it, and now there's basically none. And I do think that for the 50,000 people who work at the State Department, or in the 2-3 million who work at the Defense Department, they got to wake up every day and not think we're evil. And I think that at a certain point, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze in terms of supporting this completely rogue entity that has absolutely no regard for the optics, the international law, to say nothing of the kind of moral harm that's done from these kind of imperial middle managers, because you're supposed to sort of manage empire. You're not supposed to go full blown ethnic cleansing. And I think that there possibly could be within that framework people who are saying now is the time for Israel to wrap it up. I've thought that maybe was coming a couple times. So maybe, but I do think Biden is so far to the right to even certainly to what Obama would have been. Because traditionally what it is, and this is a bit medieval, but it's like, basically, fine, eye for an eye, go, they titted, you tat, you go kill 5,000 people, then we call it. I mean, that's really, I think, the formulation they use. And that's kind of the formulation that a lot of foreign policy experts will sort of say implicitly when they talk about, disincentivizing terrorism by having a proportional blah, blah, blah. And they have a number somewhere in Israel. I think it's 1,000 to 1, basically, where they value Israeli lives to Palestinian lives. And they've well exceeded that. I mean, we're talking probably northwards of somewhere 100,000, obviously hundreds of thousands displaced. People have moved, 20, 30 times. It's complete hell. And so I think that with an understanding, and again, in January of this year, Secretary of State Blinken told Netanyahu, according to NBC News' Andrea Mitchell, told Netanyahu behind closed doors that defeating Hamas militarily was impossible. This is something everybody knows. This is something everyone knew on October 8th. You cannot defeat national liberation guerrilla movements with occupation and bombing. It's, you may not like their tactics or may not like their ideology, but that's just 101 stuff. It didn't work for the Taliban. It's not going to work. Hamas is not ISIS. They're not a mercenary army. They are Palestinian. They are of Gaza. They are of Palestine. They're all, the vast majority of whom had parents killed by Israel. These are highly motivated, especially now that they've created, hundreds of thousands of more orphans and hundreds of thousands of more parents without children. The idea that they're all just going to kind of roll over and become compliant NGO, employees and yeoman fishermen is a fantasy. It's a liberal fantasy, and you see this in this implicitly genocidal day after reporting or day after discourse. Day after what? There's nothing left. And you think these people are just going to hand in their guns and say, okay, do what you want with us, United States. Hand us over to whatever Vichy, what I call the sort of Rena Arab plan that Blinken's and McGork are trying to float about. Oh, we're going to bring in one plan had them bringing in people from Morocco. I'm like, that's 4,000 miles away. What does this have to do with Palestine? They're just these interchangeable Arabs to them. And everybody knows that, and this is the taboo, right? Nobody wants to say Hamas survives this so-called war because they're going to no matter what. The issue is whether or not there's 2,000 dead kids, 500 dead kids, or what we're at now, which is probably somewhere north of 20, 25,000 dead kids. Either way, we're going to end up circling back to the exact same political position we were in on October 8th. And everybody knows this. So even by their own criteria, this mass death is completely gratuitous. It is completely about collective punishment. It is about medieval recompense. And the fundamental political problem won't change.
Yeah, I always find it really kind of dystopian when America, that's been fully supporting this genocide from moment one, kind of pretends to be some kind of moral arbiter in between the two sides, and you know, like making these kinds of comments, like you talked about this day after kind of plan that's been leaked, like making these kinds of demands of Palestinians, like in no way will Hamas or anyone else be in any form of power in this like reconstructed version of Palestinian society. And it's like, I don't understand where they get the audacity to make these kinds of demands when they've been arming the genocide the whole time.
That was the hole in the whole fake ceasefire, right? The May 31st speech Biden gave where he's like, we need to end the war. And then you say, okay, well, who's going to run Gaza? And they're like, oh, this Rena army funded by Saudi Arabia and other and Emirati, despots. And it's like, well, wait a second. So you're going to this extent, Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel have been far more honest, because you're going to end the war mysteriously through some ceasefire, and then Hamas does what? Just gives their guns and goes away? It doesn't make any sense. It's never made any sense, because they don't want to end the war. They want to keep doing it until they have killed enough children to where Hamas is forced to surrender. That's their goal. That's their plan. And this is why they talk about it lasting for years. That is the only way you can subjugate national liberation movements that are meaningfully popular, even if it's over, even if it's 40, 50%, whatever it is through ethnic cleansing. That is the only way you can defeat a popular or sort of, an insurrection army. Again, that doesn't mean that people all love Hamas or support their ideology within Gaza, but they're the guys with guns who are defending them from the other guys with the guns who are trying to remove them from the earth. So, and again, this is what Tony Blinken himself says. This is not a controversial claim. This is what analysts say, State Department officials, when they've gone to, their sort of CSIS conference or their Center for American Progress conference, they'll say this. This is not, Hamas is not going to surrender. They're not going to stop fighting because Hamas is an idea. Everybody who's lost a parent is going to go pick up a gun or pick up an RPG and try to kill as many Zionists as they can. So, this is going to keep going on for months and months and months and months unless the president of the United States is forced, either by circumstance or by moral conviction, not that that's a possibility, to make the phone call and say, all right, you guys have done, you've gotten your medieval revenge. It's time to wrap it up.
On the Harris angle, like, I really do understand why people are really desperate to believe that there's going to be a difference in the policies. Because it's like, I know that people don't want Trump and JD Vance to win this election. No one has any illusions that they're going to be any better on Gaza or any other issue. In fact, they're guaranteed to be worse on most every single other issue. So I understand why people are gravitating towards the kind of like ironic coconut meme thing. And like, people are really desperate to believe this. And also there's this idea about Kamala Harris that despite whatever her past statements are, her speeches to AIPAC money that she's taken, there is an opportunity here to have kind of a clean slate and chart a different course, in her terminology, to unburden by what has been, which is just like, I don't see how it's such a difficult decision. I think if from a moral standpoint, distancing yourself from Netanyahu and the mountains of corpses and dead kids that they've created over the last 10 months. Like, if you're not swayed by that moral argument, and like, I don't understand what else has to happen in order to do that. Netanyahu is deeply unpopular in Israel and everywhere. He's this corrupt war criminal. I don't understand why it's so hard to just cut this guy off and distance yourself from him. It's politically a good decision to do, and it's morally the correct thing to do as well. So you're talking about a political position and a level of popularity that isn't as prevalent throughout the broader voter base. To the progressive base, to liberals, most liberals, yeah, I think it's
depending
popular,
how you frame the question. That's not really true. I mean, the majority of Americans do support a ceasefire, but then I think when you drill down,
I think he's talking about the alliance with Israel, though.
Oh, sorry,
cutting him off is like cutting off Israel is like a totally different question than a ceasefire.
They don't need to cut off Israel, though. That's the thing. Historically, when Biden makes the phone call in 2021, the implication is that there will be cutting off, but they never has to get to that. That's the thing. No one really actually needs to cut off Israel to make that phone call, right? There needs to be a credible threat. They will be cut off, but everybody knows what it means, and it won't really get to that point. The point is they have the power, they have the leverage, they can do it. And this is why Biden never needs to call for a ceasefire. It's like the universe ending. You don't see it coming; it just happens. The idea that somehow we need to have him use the shibboleth of ceasefire is a total, I think, a misunderstanding of historically how this has worked. Both again, 2014, 2018, 2021, 20. And then what would have been today. And I think that that's kind of why the demand is to say cut off Israel, because the implication of that is that this is a genuine, how you get to a genuine ceasefire. But all that would and should and will eventually, because again, it's going to happen eventually, happen behind closed doors. I think on the issue of what Harris believes, I don't think it really benefits anyone to assume either way. I don't think it benefits one to sort of assume that she has, or to project some pro ceasefire position on her that there's no evidence that exists. I'm also not totally I certainly understand why people take this track, and I'm sympathetic to it, but I'm not sure it's totally worth writing it off entirely either. I think it very much is a wait and see situation. I know this is what the Uncommitted campaign has said they're doing. Again, it really boils down to a cost benefit politically. How can you do this in a way that is, and it's awkward because she's not the president, right? She can't actually, even if she wanted to, end it. But there are things I think she could say, and there's people, organizations, and people I trust. There's exactly one member of Congress I trust to make that determination as to whether or not those assurances are sufficient. And my guess is that will not be forthcoming. But I want to be proven wrong, and I think those who, and this is where you get into the fundamental problem with all activism, which is, where do you hold the line and where do you sort of capitulate under the specter of a Trump-Vance, regime? And I'm not going to sort of doubt that's beyond my scope. But I will say that if you begin these exchanges by preemptively, submitting your fealty to the nominee without any conditions, then you don't have any power. You have no influence. And I think that it was when everyone started to consolidate around Harris, and Rashida Tlaib said, no, I'm going to wait to see what she says. And UAW, United Auto Workers, said, we're going to wait and see what she says, partly based on Gaza, according to the New York Times. I think that was a far savvier track, a far more humane track, rather than jumping on the bandwagon. Because if genocide, which again, I think everyone agrees this is, if that can't raise to the level of a condition of support, then I don't know what can. And power and support that is given unconditionally has no power. It has no leverage. You're like the Saudi parliament. You're purely in an advisory capacity. And I think this is the problem where everyone sort of rushes, and that's why I thought the opportunity of having a mini primary, as much as I would not like to see, Mr. Beast, do a primary debate or whatever. And as much as I do think that in terms of the kind of normal standards, Kamala Harris, of course, had the most democratic legitimacy in the sense that people actually voted for her. And they especially voted for her knowing that she was the running mate of a decaying corpse. So the implication was that she would likely take the reins at some point. I think it would have provided a lot of leverage to the so-called electoral left, in the sense that we're not just going to roll over and pull the lever, that because genocide is the crime of crimes, right? It's the most important thing, right? This isn't like zoning reform or capital gains tax. This is fucking genocide. This is the killing of children every day on social media. That there had to be something that you would sort of stick your flag and say, sorry, right? It's the Jean-Luc Picard, this far, no further. Like, we cannot capitulate on this. We cannot constantly just have people yell Project 2025 in our face and look the other way while people are committing genocide, because they still have the power to do something. And I think this is where when people get into the whole lesser of two evils voting debate, I always find it very tedious, because ultimately it's academic. Because what that conversation does is it shifts the moral burden away from people in power and puts it on obscure fucking random people on Twitter or people you meet. And the reality is that Biden has agency. Kamala Harris has agency. They have agency. They can make these decisions, and the focus and the intensity should always be focused on people in power. And to the extent to which Harris wants to piss away any credibility she has with progressives or the left because she won't make these commitments, that's ultimately her responsibility. That is ultimately her decision. And if she doesn't believe that there's a credible chance that she will lose a meaningful constituency, and this is where you get into the kind of game theory, right? The prisoner's dilemma. If she doesn't genuinely believe that they're gonna sit on the couch, not to make a veiled JD Vance reference. If she doesn't credibly believe that, then there's no power, because that's all you have, right? And that's unfortunate, and it sucks it got to that position, and I wish it wasn't. But based on the nature of the system and based on the nature of Biden's recalcitrance and unwillingness to compromise at all, this is where we are at. You can't. And I think most people who've had dozens of family members die, the idea that you would go to them and say, well, Trump would also commit genocide, it's not a meaningful statement. Even if it's strictly speaking true, it's not a morally meaningful statement. It is extortative, it is cruel, it is glib. And ultimately it assumes that those in power, or rather de-emphasizes the fact that those in power are the ones who ultimately make decisions, not random fucking people.
What do you make of some of the spin and messaging from her team and from the reporting about her meeting with Netanyahu, which apparently just took place about 15 minutes ago? I saw a clip of it. It was just a brief handshake. I'm sure they're going to sit and talk, but I saw some people sharing excerpts of what this plan was, which was they'll meet privately. They will, she reportedly will push him to end the war. But I think, like you mentioned earlier, she has certain constraints.
Well, like, right, because she's not the president.
She's tied, exactly. She's tied to Biden. And Natasha Lennard did a good piece in The Intercept about this earlier this week, about how while she is seeing more energy, and especially with younger people, like you just pointed out, like she's making gains where Biden was lagging. You're seeing tighter poll numbers. People are throwing away their leverage by just quickly consolidating behind her without expecting any concessions or asking for anything, right? Which is just pure politics. Do you think there's anything to read into about this messaging that they are putting out? Oh, she's going to push him, acknowledging
the Biden's been using the same messaging for 6 months. I'm sorry, you're the world's biggest mark if you think this means anything. Now, it doesn't not mean anything. It could mean that she's genuinely saying, by the way, when I come to power, it's party over. I don't know, but it's pushing for a ceasefire. What does that mean? Again, this I know she's not the president, but this whole assumption that Biden is pushing for a ceasefire is a total false market. He can fucking enforce one whenever he wants. And that's by the way was taken for granted for months, until suddenly in February and March there became this nebulous ceasefire negotiation. We were constantly it's a burden shift, because now it's not his fault. He's just a third party arbiter, right? Moderating a debate between two warring parties. They wash their fucking hands of it. And it's a total misunderstanding of how these things work, which is you don't need Israel to agree to anything. Israel cannot take a piss without asking our permission. So the idea that Biden somehow needs to we need Israel to sign off on it, not really. It would be nice, but you really don't need to. What you need to say is, by the way, Blinken said this back in January. He said, we're going to have Israel wrap it up in 6 weeks. And they didn't, because there was no enforcement mechanism. And everybody knew that. And again, I think one cannot comprehend how far out of the extreme Biden is, even historically, from presidents like Reagan, Obama. They let them do their apartheid, right? They let them have their fucking, in 2014, right? 1,523 civilians were killed in Gaza during their bombing campaign, which I used to think was extremely high. Now I'm shocked. It's so trivial compared to what we have now, including over 550 children, right? You have your little bombing raid, do a little, by the way, only 6 Israelis were killed in that, one of them in that war in 2014 war. One of them died of a heart attack. And so that was sort of the standard. You let them do their kind of what they call mowing the grass. The idea of a full-blown effort to ethnically cleanse, a full-blown genocide, a full-blown collective punishment is completely extraordinary. And this is why even pro-Israel, pro-apartheid governments in Europe are shocked and outraged and pass, UN resolutions condemning them. This is so far out of the ordinary, so far out of what even the kind of normal imperial management. It's why the CIA doesn't like it. So do I think Harris would be that extreme? Probably not. But she has to give some actual indication or have some conversations, even in private, with some group who's credible, who I actually trust, not one of these, zombie blue MAGA types, or even some of these, I think, kind of more dubious kind of sheepdogging operations, to say, here's the level, here's what I'm going to do. Because there is a playbook for it. And Harris knows this, to end the carnage and get to some kind of, I want to say political solution, but Harris wouldn't even support that. But at the very least, we can agree that we have to stop killing dozens of people a day. Right. And what that looks like, it needs, if she can't do it publicly because she's a vice president, fine, I get it. But there's definitely plenty of people. And again, there's a very specific and conspicuous representative in Congress whom she can make assurances to, who could relay that information. I have yet to see anyone with any credibility say that she's presented anything at all that was credible, that wasn't just doing this rhetorical ceasefire trickery and cup and ball game.
And like Jordan, to your point earlier too about the sort of average American citizen, about they're nowhere near where the sort of like progressive left might be on this. That's a totally valid point. It's probably much more complicated than I'm making it out to be. I do think though, on that note, like there has been a lot of like mainstream reporting about this kind of stuff that I think is so new, and we're so not used to our mainstream media in the West really showing the details of what this looks like. I don't know if either of you saw that, like CBS news report about the like American
and that was the
surgeon,
Sunday morning show, which is directed towards 85-year-olds.
The American surgeon that went to Gaza, that was like, this is the worst thing that I've ever seen in my life. There's children and toddlers being deliberately targeted by snipers. Like this is on, like you're saying, this is on mainstream American news media, which is kind of shocking. And I do feel like you're absolutely right that there's still a gulf between what the average person believes or knows about it. But I feel like there's more space than ever before to carve out a sort of different position on this.
Whether or not Gaza is a drag on the Democrats is within Democratic circles is simply taken for granted. This is the thing. Publicly, they say, "Oh, well, people support Israel in the abstract," but there was an internal memo leaked to CNN by Biden staffers and people within the vice president's office who were basically running a parallel campaign. And one of the things they noted that Harris would benefit from greatly was not being associated with genocide in Gaza. So if it was this popular thing, they wouldn't have said that. Within these circles, within these electoral circles, it's taken for granted that Gaza is an albatross. It is only within the sort of spin kind of, oh, Biden's actually not, there's this poll, they asked youth voters what they wanted. And the third most important thing was Gaza, but it wasn't the first. So it's not, that's all bullshit. Everybody knows that Biden's stained by this. Genocide Joe is alliterative. It's catchy. Everybody knows that these images of dead kids. And again, they can try to burden it over to Hamas or burden over this mysterious peace process all they want. And I think Harris benefits greatly from not being associated with that. But in terms of like, progressive sanction, right? Sort of progressive adjacent media or progressive people within Congress giving their stamp of approval to Harris, there has to be something more than just recycling the same fucking ceasefire rhetorical cup and ball game that Biden and his staff have been doing since the Michigan primaries in early March. There has to be something else. There has to be more to that. So they know. And again, I think it's part of the reasons why there was an effort to switch the candidates. I don't think it was the main reason, but I certainly think it was one of them, which is there was so much horrible PR around this White House for various reasons. Obviously, the age being number one, but I do think number 2, 3 on that list was his association with, frankly, just constant stream of dead kid images, and that was like not good. And that's why they had to do this whole, we support ceasefire, asterisks. Don't look at the asterisks. It actually means something else entirely now.
So you are someone who does a lot of media criticism, which I appreciate and often look to. Let's say we get a couple months in, or let's say October. God forbid it lasts that long, but it could last longer. They've already talked about it lasting beyond this year. But let's say there is some sort of resolution, even if it is just kind of a heavily asterisked ceasefire deal that the U.S. brokers, whatever. And it's sold to the media or presented by the Biden administration to the media as a ceasefire. With, of course, all the caveats you just mentioned, but like how the media would frame it in your mind, I'm curious about, because that sets up Harris to take that PR win, shed some of the baggage from Biden. But do you see a scenario where, the fighting continues? Israel has said, like, we're just going to keep fighting until we achieve our goals. The U.S. is trying to spin it. How does that impact the campaign?
You mean if there's a temporary pause, but Israel says after 2 weeks, we're going to go back to doing genocide?
Yeah.
It really depends on the internal machinations of those commitments, because historically they've said they're going to keep fighting, but then they don't. This seems different though, obviously. I mean, the scale is completely unprecedented. So I think they're going for broke because they don't really have much of a choice, because then if they stop today, then people would say, well, wait, you're back politically in the same position you were on October 7th. You're just negotiating with rubble now, and after tens of thousands of dead kids, but we're back to the same fundamental problem, which is the problem of apartheid and dispossession and ethnic cleansing. So, I don't know, but look, if they get a genuine ceasefire, which is to say and I was hopeful the one in November would keep lasting, but Israel said no. I mean, again, to their credit, they're honest. They're like, no, once we get hostages back, we're going to go back to killing a bunch of Palestinians. And that's exactly what they did. So like, if there was a genuine ceasefire that again, the CIA sort of viewed as being more permanent, then I'll get a fucking coconut tattoo on my face. I'm not seriously at this point. I'm not desperate, but there has to be genuine progress and genuine end to the bloodshed. We can't keep falling for bullshit rhetoric and burden shifts onto some mysterious negotiation. I'm begging liberals to not be so fucking credulous. That there has to be, this is not something out of the US's hands. Biden can do this whenever he wants. And presumably as the, presumptive nominee, Harris has a lot more leverage now to make that happen. She can pressure Biden to do what should have happened months ago. And, if she wants to keep hiding behind this ceasefire rhetoric and this, these supposed, negotiations, then that's bullshit. And I don't think that's a rhetorical gesture that anyone with any credibility is going to fall for or sign off on. And then that's who I look for. I look for Palestinian organizations, the Uncommitted Movement, other groups. I look for Rashida Tlaib. I look for these groups to say, okay, well, this was sufficient. Obviously, there's gray area there, but until that happens, it's just vibes. It's just wishful thinking.
Let me rephrase that a little bit then. It's not so much like what is she going to do? It's what do you think the media will sell that as? How would they cover that? How would they frame that?
If it was genuinely temporary? I mean, the thing is, temporary pauses are historically they can turn into something longer. And supposedly that's what the White House says they want. But on the other hand, they say, actually, no, we need to eliminate Hamas. And those two things are in direct contradiction. The sort of like other factor here, which I think which is coming into play, at least for some of the lower level people who aren't as ideologically committed, is that because of what happened with Afghanistan, that in the event that there's a genuine ceasefire and then the media spins it as Hamas wins, this could sort of be demagogued in that way, similar to what the Afghanistan pullout was, even though any pullout of Afghanistan was going to look like that, because that's what losing a war looks like. Now, Israel would not be losing in Gaza in any meaningful sense because, they killed hundreds
estimated.
Right. Exactly. But, it could be spun that way. So generously, maybe they're worried about that, although I don't really think that's the main reason. I think that once in the first few weeks, they really rhetorically painted themselves in a corner by saying, no, we support the elimination of Hamas. Just as you say, we support the elimination of Taliban gets you 20 years and an untold amount of death and destruction. Because when you commit to trying to remove a guerrilla force from an indigenous population, your chances of success are literally zero unless you commit ethnic cleansing, unless you literally just would do what Israel wanted to do until they were stopped by Egypt and France and the UK and US, which is to push them all into the Sinai. And this is the plan that every right-wing think tank in Israel has had for years. They call it the New State Solution, which is to push everyone in Gaza into Sinai, cut it off, and then turn the Sinai into a quote-unquote Palestinian state under the protectorate of the Egyptian government. And I believe that's initially what they were trying to do. I just don't think they could physically push everyone into the Sinai. They were ultimately, their plan was kiboshed. But so, they committed to that outcome, and it's impossible. So what you have is just endless, gratuitous death, because from Israel's perspective, as long as they're just, killing Palestinians and subjugating them and humiliating them, they're winning because they have all the power. I mean, the deaths are, 20, 30, 40 to 1.
Yeah. And well, I don't know if this is like conspiratorial. I don't think so. But that's one of the reasons that I kind of highly doubt that this will be anywhere near wrapped up by the time the election rolls around. Because it seems like on the part of Netanyahu and his government, they would much rather Trump come in, because Trump's not going to have any of these even the fake constraints or any of the hand wringing. You've got Trump and Netanyahu both using this kind of like they need to finish the job rhetoric, like it's almost like identical. Which is yet another reason why I think the Democrats would be smart to like distance themselves from this guy that's not only a mass murderer and a war criminal, but someone who clearly supports their opponent. You know, Trump's very, very popular in Israel for that exact reason. But yeah, I think that's kind of an element too that makes me kind of skeptical that there is going to be anything notable happening between now and the election.
It's right wing and very right wing, and morally, it just doesn't. It's like people made a big deal out of Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem, rightfully so. But, that was a move supported by Joe Biden. That was a move supported by the Anti-Defamation League. That was a move supported by the vast majority of Democrats in Congress. So even these like right wing, the occupation of the Golan Heights, the apartheid regime itself, all have like massive bipartisan support. So, I don't know. Again, when you're talking about the supporting, arming, and backing of a genocide, to sort of try to game out theoretically whether or not some other candidate would have a worse genocide strikes me as kind of insensitive, even if it is maybe academically true or it feels true. It seems like a bit of a non sequitur. So I don't, also by the time Trump comes around, it's like, that's going to be what, 6 months from now, 7 months from now. So how many, was that another 50, 60,000 dead Palestinians?
Yeah.
Of disease and famine, and now there's the polio outbreak. So okay, that's a really inspiring message for the Democratic base.
We didn't even get to his speech, but I guess just very quickly. I mean, you saw that bipartisan support in Congress yesterday. He demanded more weapons, but and of course all the standard stuff you would expect from Netanyahu. But one thing I thought was especially disgusting was when talking about Trump and the assassination attempt, he made that comment, there is no room for political violence in democracies. Yeah. Just how did that make you feel when you heard that comment?
I'm fascinated by the term political violence. We have a running tab on our podcast for what we call suspicious qualifiers, right? Sort of when people say things like crony capitalism. And I'm like, well, why not just say capitalism? Political violence. Because if you say we oppose violence, obviously people would say, well, wait a second. That's obviously not true. The U.S. exports more arms and weapons than any country on earth. We're obviously, between natural gas and soy, it's our biggest export. Violence. What are you talking about? Political violence. Oh, you mean when you attack someone in a sort of non-state sanctioned way when it's, someone in the club? Yeah, I mean, obviously it's all political. I don't want to sound too dorm room here, but the idea that there's some big distinction between, having a bunch of, 21-year-old college kids, amped up on racist fantasies going out in Gaza and sniping kids at will is somehow not a form of political violence. I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. I don't know what the moral distinction is, frankly, especially since there appears to be absolutely no code of ethics or rule of order at all. And to the extent to which there is, it's everybody go out and have fun. This is open season. I mean, Israeli soldiers post the fucking war crimes on Telegram, 50 times a day, and people document it and they publish articles on it. Nobody cares. There's obviously a policy of just kind of do whatever you want. And not only can you do whatever you want, you can put it on Instagram and TikTok and Telegram. So I don't know what the fuck he's talking about.
Yeah, I don't see much of a distinction. But yeah, that was a lot, especially egregious in an already terrible speech. Adam, I want to thank you for your time. Where can people follow you and find more of your work?
I don't know. I have a podcast called Citations Needed. I guess that's a fun one. And then I write for various publications.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you for having me. Y'all take it easy.